I'm particularly excited to moderate this discussion. Not only do we have leading industry experts in the field, it's always seemingly changing as far as the definition, which we'll discuss here shortly. But one that's exciting to talk about and to think about the future of healthcare and how we can bring improved healthcare quality to our patients. And so you'll be hearing from a number of industry experts on this topic, how they implemented systems of innovation within their own organizations, and how do they measure that and determine success and move from there. And so we'll kick off, I believe, first with introductions from each panelist. So I'll start with Jay Brennan from Cone Health. Jay, if you want to kick us off with the introduction.
Yes, thank you, Lance. I'm Jay Brennan, co-founder of Pronovo. We work with health systems to staff, manage, and operate health venture offices within their health system. And through this health venture office, we typically identify partners, locate those companies, negotiate deals, and then accelerate the co-development through our relationship.
Thanks so much, Jay. And also joining us from Cone Health, we have Greg Hewitt. Greg, would you mind giving us an intro?
Yeah, hey everyone. Greg Hewitt, Executive Director of Innovation at Cone Health. I've been at Cone for coming up on 6 years. Prior to that, I worked in research and innovation for a consultancy based out of Cincinnati. Did a lot of work in consumer packaged goods, food and beverage, and lots of other industries. Along the journey, met Jay and Mark from Pronovo, and made a whole lot of sense to sort of build them into our innovation program at Cone Health. And I'm sure we'll probably get more into that as we talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. And last but not least, Dr. Hank Capps from Wellstar. Would you mind providing an intro? Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Hank Capps. I'm the EVP, Chief Information and Digital Officer at Wellstar Health System. I've been here since January. Prior to that, I was at Novant Health for 18 years in North Carolina. So excited to spend a little bit of time with you today.
So as you can see, we have an excellent panel. Just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a family medicine physician, but have spent the last 10 years really trying to understand how to unlock innovation within large healthcare systems, primarily from the side of a startup. How does a small company that's resource limited work with a major institution like some of these represented today in the means of a relationship that can advance both parties, either through clinical trial, research, or even co-development opportunities. And so I'm very excited to learn. What I've noticed over the past decade of working with these companies is that nobody has it figured out. There's not a cookbook recipe that you can apply to institutions across the board. It really has to be a personalized approach. And I think you're going to be able to pull a lot of interesting factoids away from this discussion that can apply to your own institution or apply to your own organization to make shift an innovation program that best represents your institution as well as your provider community. So let's kick off. I think we have a question first from Heather. Heather, do we have a polling question to begin with? There we go. So what size organization are you affiliated? We left this pretty generic, so go ahead and whatever you think the size of your organization is, go ahead and answer that. We'll wait a few seconds here while we get the polls coming in. This live action data makes it feel more exciting. Great, so we have a great representation of large health systems. And then also folks that are not a health system altogether. So awesome perspective that we bring into the table. All right, thanks for that. So we have a pretty good mix. We're going to move to our first question.
Lance, did you want the next polling question that was a follow-on to this?
So do you consider your organization to be innovative? Is the next question we're going to have come up here. Give it a few seconds for you all to respond. And as you'll see, innovation is a subjective term to many, and it's hard to pin down a definition. So please, whatever you consider to be innovation, answered to your best ability. Pretty interesting. So nobody's shown the strong side of yes, it appears, which is great. You're in the right spot to learn and to hear more from folks that I would say do definitely lean more on the right-hand side. I'm also surprised to see the larger health systems, at least the responders, consider themselves more innovative than the mid and the smaller health systems. That's pretty interesting. We always talk about large bureaucratic health systems being challenging to move the ship, while smaller ones may be easier to pivot. So keep these responses in mind. We'll bring it back up. Let's define what an care, especially now we're in this new age of almost post-pandemic, and really considering how we had to jump into things like telehealth over the past year at a rate before heard of. Even mean? I think we throw that term around way too often and not really define it clearly. So let's get off on the right start and just actually have it defined. So if we can start with Hank, Dr. Capps, to answer this question first, and then we'll go through. We'll go to Jay next, and then Greg. Dr. Capps.
Yeah. So Lance, you were coming in and out for me, but I think the framing of the question was around innovation being very helpful, very important in healthcare right now, particularly like what have we been through over the last 18 months, and how are we defining disruptive innovation as a part of all of that inside our areas. So, really, if you think back to how to construct a model for disruption and for innovation, you really have to think back to some of these sentinel events that have really changed the inflection point for healthcare. A lot of times, I'd call them generational disruptions. And when we talked about this before, we would typically point to some sort of technology. The moment that Steve Jobs stood on the stage with the iPhone, it changed the inflection of how we were going to interact with each other going forward. We didn't know it at the moment in time he did that, but there was this ripple in the pond of innovation, some of which was incremental, some of which was game-changing, in that sense became very disruptive overall. Healthcare, the electronic health records, at the moment in time that the ACA pushed all of us toward having electronic health records, it completely shifted a way in which we had continuity with our patients. For generations, the continuity with patients had always lived at the relationship level. There were hospitals, there were clinics. It was built around how the individual one-to-one relationships happened, whether it be a nurse or doctor, and our care models were built around that until the moment we had electronic information that then bled across all of the different venues of care which patients were being seen and cared for. And so when you think about those kind of sentinel moments that created massive disruption in the healthcare environment and our care models adjusted to them, it brings you to the moment in time last March that you alluded to, which is, at the moment that the national emergency was declared for COVID and we were in the midst of a global pandemic, we now were not in a technological generational disruption, but we were in the midst of a disruption that was going to touch all parts of our healthcare system and how we deliver care, not only in the United States, but across the world. And so that disruption that happens as it relates to the markets, we sit lying in wait to be able to navigate. In that moment with the emergency declaration, we all moved into the future 4 or 5 years. We were doing things that were on long-term roadmaps 48 hours later, because we were literally in real time rolling up our sleeves to take care of patients in the midst of this kind of moment in time that was a generational disruption. And then all that has transpired since then have been, in some senses, the reorganizing of the disintermediation of healthcare that happened in that moment of time. And so there's this disruption that's happening in the environment and in the marketplace. And then there is, how are we going to be proactive and respond in delivering the care of the future, and designing that in the midst of these disruptions, and becoming disruptive from the inside out as well as from the outside in. And so the word gets overused in a sense that it can mean so many different things. But for healthcare providers and the healthcare industry as a whole, these disruptions set up an opportunity for us to be able to leverage the innovation of the past to transform care as we're doing it. I mean, we were making the plane, flying the plane, and designing the plane all at the same time. And at Wellstar, we have the strong belief that that innovation and the proactive seeking of what is next is going to be a differentiator in the long term for the care of our patients in the communities. And then all of the things that kind of flow in after that around to your mission and the vision of where you're going, all lay that foundation for how disruptive innovation can be defined. And in this case, we're talking about, we've all been disrupted, and we now are looking at the ways in which we pull forward the capabilities that we need in the future to design what the future of care is going to look like. So it becomes much more proactive and much less reactive to the environment when you start designing it forward, not just looking back or in the moment.
I appreciate that. Can you all hear me? I called in instead of using. Great. Thanks so much for that, Hank. But Jay, can you follow? That was a fantastic overview. Can you follow in on that and represent Cone Health's thoughts on innovation?
Well, Greg's going to follow in a minute with a little more about Cone Health's perspective. I think one of the unique perspectives that I bring is that, unlike a lot of folks, probably most of the folks who are listening to this and the other folks on the panel, I've been engaged with healthcare for only about 4 years. And so I come from other industry experiences, a lot of different background. And one of the things that I observed when I began working with Cone Health was that there are these, as Hank alluded to, there are these major shifts that are going on. But to me, one of the most dramatic things that I observed was in most industries where I'd been involved, there's a huge focus on consumer-centric, trying to understand what does the consumer really want, need, and it drives from that direction. And for a whole variety of reasons, healthcare was not really built that way. I mean, there's so much built around the payers. There's so much built around the providers. And so I think from my perspective, coming into this industry, the real key thing is consumers are getting a voice. Consumers, healthcare is changing and focusing more on consumers. And the challenge for all of us is we can either address that and try to find ways that we can get in front of the consumers and try to provide them the experience and the service that they're looking for, or somebody else is going to do it for us. And so I really feel that now is a time when we really have to make that move, because the big guys are out there that are going to be moving, whether it's Amazon or Google or Apple, who knows exactly how it's going to shape up, but those trends are real. And we need to figure out how to apply the lessons that we can learn from those folks into our health systems, or we're going to get left behind. And I think that's not going to be a future that any of us want to see.
Thanks for that, Jay. And Greg, I'd love for you to take a stab at this as well, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that I think are really interesting because it kind of pertains to your background, Greg, having come from multiple industries that aren't necessarily healthcare. Jay mentioned consumer-centric, which I think obviously is new for healthcare to consider. And then Hank obviously mentioning other industry leaders that have been innovative in their past and how healthcare can emulate that. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that in particular, is how do we take what's already been demonstrably innovative in other industries and sectors and transfigure that to work within the healthcare community?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just make a quick comment about even the language that we use. So Jay used the language consumer, I think in the healthcare industry, that term doesn't come with the sort of the greatest perspective, right? It's like, no, some will say, no, they're patients. They're my patients. We serve our patients. I think that concept in and of itself could be a whole hour-long discussion about how we perceive those we serve. And as I see a shift to patient-centric or consumer-centric, that pendulum can shift too far, where we leave out, from an innovation standpoint, what we call the care ecosystem. And guess what? Guess who's involved in that? The patient, the care team, the nurses, the nurse tech, the providers. So how we innovate for the system is really critical. I think we tend to sort of shift back and forth in healthcare. We've got to look at the whole and really design for the system. So that's just sort of an overarching comment. Hank, I loved your sort of synopsis of how we got here. Is really beautiful. And I think as we define disruption, I'll just take maybe an angle around where did this term sort of get coined, right? It's Clayton Christensen coined this term disruptive innovation. And I think I've seen this term from his definition in some ways kind of bastardized, right? So a lot of our folks at Cone Health said, we want to do something really disruptive. But if we look at Christensen's definition of this, it's really about disruption occurs when a smaller company with limited resources steps in and looks at an overlooked segment in the population with the most basic functionality, right? So we go down market, we find a segment, we create something with a basic functionality at a lower price. When that company starts improving those products and services, maybe even expanding what those services look like, they're able to move up market. And then you get those mainstream customers taking note, right? And they start saying, wow, there's some real value in those products and services. And before you know it, the incumbent is feeling like, wow, this is too late. Netflix is a great example with Blockbuster responding too late. I think retail health is a potential disruptor to health systems. And I would say retail health is specifically could disrupt our primary care services in health systems. And I think for some of, there's a lot of larger health systems on this call. For large health systems to say, we're going to deliberately go down market, peel off a thin slice of our segmentation. We're going to design something at a low cost, basic functionality. That's just not how we think. And it's hard to ship business models to support that kind of effort. So I think the value in this conversation, from my perspective, is sort of elevating our how strategically conscious we are of the language that we're using. And if we're going to say, as innovators on this call, we need to be aware of when somebody's saying they truly want to disrupt, we need to just clarify what they mean, right? Do they mean making a big dent in terms of how we do things in our organization? Is that disruptive? Well, Christensen would say no, right? Is designing something really cool or new disruptive? Not in his definition. It could disrupt how we practice, how we design things, and it could be very different. So I know what I listen for is, are they truly saying Christensen's definition? If so, that impacts our process of how we approach that work. If I get a sense that they really are just saying we want to do something awesome, then I know that we'll follow our design process to see, what kind of unmet needs we can design for. So those are just some thoughts about sort of the definition in my mind.
Just to jump off of the consumer term for a second. It's really striking because as a physician, I remember my first reaction to the term consumer, which was like, you got to be kidding. Like, patient is a very endearing, warm, relational term to me. Like, it's very meaningful. Matter of fact, it's a deeper term to me than consumer. Consumer felt superficial. I mean, dare we say customer? That would even be going further. But when you start peeling that back, you realize that the perspective's very different when you're sitting in that person's seat. And if we're more people-centric, then you realize that being a patient, and just that term, means something very different to someone who is at that moment a patient. It means vulnerable. It means anxious. And so this dynamic of healthcare navigating and acknowledging some of the comments that Jay and Greg said around the consumer and people centricity and the shifts that we're all seeing come back to some of those fundamentals, which is that you're a consumer most of the time. And then you enter the threshold of the door of clinical care and you're a patient. And it turns out that no one's signing up saying, woohoo, let's go to the doctor today. Let's go visit the ER. Let's go have surgery. So we're in an industry where the intersection of these terms and the people who are represented by those terms, give us an opportunity to think very differently about how we're connecting to them when they're out, when we're outside the four walls of traditional settings. What even are the new settings of the future? Does it even need to be a setting that we need to organize care around? And then recognizing that as our businesses continue to evolve in those moments of that disruption that Greg described, we're going to have to think differently because the patient mindset doesn't exist in the sense of that it is not going to be the way that people are choosing their care for some high percentage of the time in the future. And so this dynamic of people centricity, of understanding what it means to be a patient, bringing empathy to that, and recognizing that consumers are going to be driving how all this works more than even during consumerism of the past couple of years. We're in a post-consumerism kind of era now as we have come out of the pandemic, because it's not just an acknowledgement of the consumer, they're driving how we're delivering care in new and different ways. And doctors are now open to that demand, which was not the case 18 months ago, 24 months ago, or not to the degree of openness.
Hank, I love that. That is so spot on. We often talk on our team about how there's such a shift from healthcare being largely paternalistic historically to this shift where patients want to be active participants in the experience. And so I know we've got some projects we're working on where we are designing for participatory engagement in the process, right? People have a very different approach in how they seek care and how they want to experience it. And so, yeah, we're working on some projects right now that target very specifically that patient experience more to being a participant.
Thank you all for that. I think definition of terms is vital to provide context, especially for this type of discussion. And so now that we've defined to some extent further what disruptive innovation means, I'd like to re-poll the audience. So this next question is for you if you're listening. Do you consider your organization innovative? You've answered this question once before, but now that you've heard what these experts consider to be innovative, where do you feel like you stand or your organization stands within this?
And as a reminder, these are our results from the last time.
So we had a 3 with the large health systems. As we're looking over these results, I'm just curious, from our panelists, how would you rate your own organization on a scale from 1 to 10, I guess 10 being innovative perfection? Anybody can take a stab at it.
It's such a hard question because there's pockets, right? We have pockets within our system that are a 9, or I would say close to a 10. And then there are others that, fall to a 1, right? So it's, in the aggregate, I would say, call it a 5.
Yes. So I think we're going to be tough graders, right? By virtue of our inherent biases on this. I think it's a 5 or 6 because it's, again, that same kind of balance of, 9, 10 to 1, 2, some of which is natural in organizations as well.
And our discussion has made people tougher on themselves, Hank, because our scores went down. So now that they're thinking about it, they realize even more. There's a longer way to go than they thought.
That's great. I think it's really important, as Greg pointed out, to recognize the wins that you do have within your organization and not necessarily always look at the whole group as a weather vane. We have, in the health systems that I've worked with, certainly traditionally more innovative, I guess you can say, specialties than others as far as research and producing startup companies and new ideas. And we use those as models, as examples, in order to continue infiltrating innovative ideas across the organization. But great points. And I guess we're having our audience be a little bit more critical and thinking about what it means to be innovative, which is great. So that leads me to my next question. I mean, each of you represent organizations that you're obviously very passionate about, the innovation efforts they're in. I'd love to know, how would you describe to someone, outside your organization, of what makes Cone Health special, or what makes Wellstar special? What are the 2 or 3 things in your innovation process that you like to highlight and point out? And then how do you know those are successful? So just another multi-tiered question, but I'd love actually for each of you to have a chance to describe, the elevator pitch, if you will, of what your innovation process is and what it represents. So Jay, if you can start us off on that side.
Sure. And so, and to make sure everybody understands, my company, we're a contract organization that provide this service for Cone Health. So one of the things that I think that makes us unique and different is we're inside outsiders. And I think that's really a good perspective to have when we're talking about something as difficult as innovation, because we bring in outside perspective and we're always trying to push. Not that you folks aren't trying to push in your organizations as well, but I believe there's a difference when you've been embedded in the same organization for an extended period of time. Sometimes you don't notice that the walls are really close together and that you can't really think outside that box. And I think bringing in the outside perspective is one of the things that I feel is most unique about what we do. The other thing that I'd emphasize is the hallmark of our approach is that a health system really can't create all the innovation it needs on themselves, and they shouldn't even try to. The world is amazing with all the activity and innovation that's occurring all over the place. And I remember when we began working with Cone Health a number of years ago, I think Greg was skeptical on the number of startups working in areas that were of interest to him. And we opened up his eyes to realize there are literally hundreds of thousands of companies and hundreds of millions of dollars, or perhaps billions of dollars, trying to find solutions to problems that all of you are facing right now. And so we believe that the best thing to do is to use the health system to clarify what the need is, really understand what the patient, the consumer wants, do those types of things, but then find that best partner that you can work with so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can find a way to accelerate the process and bring them in, although I will admit then there are lots of challenges with bringing in the outside party. So, and that's what we do, is we try to facilitate that process of bringing them in. So we're a little different, I think, than what most organizations have. And I like to think that gives us a little different edge and gives Cone Health a little better edge because of our different perspectives.
Awesome. And Greg, since you've kind of been on the other side of that relationship, I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, I think my intent from the beginning, also not coming from healthcare, was to really bring sort of a strategic and competitive advantage to Cone Health through human-centered design. And I think the partnership with Jay and Pronovo, which has formed Cone Health Ventures, has been a beautiful connection between our design capabilities and our partnership capabilities. They've added something that we needed desperately. So there's a guy that wrote a book named Thomas Lockwood about innovation, and I want to read you guys a quote in terms of how we approach innovation at Cone. In fact, I'll put it in the chat here as well. In the book, it says, "So if innovation drives differentiation, what drives innovation?" It says, "The answer hidden in plain sight is design. Design contains the skills to identify possible futures, invent exciting products, build bridges to customers, crack wicked problems, and more." It says, "The fact is, if you want to innovate, you got to design." Now, I'm very biased. I come from doing 15 years of consulting with companies like Procter & Gamble, where, consumer is boss, right? That's the world that I came from. And that's the world that I want to create in healthcare, is a, humanizing healthcare in many ways. So the way we approach innovation is through leveraging our understanding of design thinking as a foundational approach. And which is the heart of design thinking is coming from a place of deep empathic understanding of the people we serve, whether that be our staff, our providers, or our customers, or our patients, or their family members. I've seen for 20 years how doing this kind of work reveals new opportunities, things that we couldn't see on the onset. So I think when you start uncovering those unmet needs and solving for those from a human perspective, and then coming in from a healthcare perspective, we start seeing new opportunities unfold. And I would say from an impact standpoint, what's occurred as a result of that perspective, I think we're seeing a transformation in our culture. As I said, I think that generally speaking, historically, healthcare has been pretty paternalistic, but we're seeing a decrease in the assumptions that we make in the beginning of any kind of project, and an increase in a desire to dig deeper to understand perceptions, opinions, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. We are taking pause now before we jump into work to say, we have a solution, let's apply it. We're saying, let's pause, let's go deeply understand the design target, whoever that might be. So I think that's been the impact of bringing in that kind of design perspective.
I just have a quick follow-up question. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about design thinking and understanding your customer, but who do you consider your customer? You mentioned physicians, providers, other folks within the health system. But when I think about Jay and what he's trying to do by bringing outside technologies in, ultimately, you're the customer for those technologies and those companies. How do you consider, you're almost in the shoes of being the customer as well as analyzing other customers. Who do you prioritize? How do you know what to focus on with this plethora of customer discovery that you have to do? Curious.
Greg, you want to jump into that, or you want me to tackle it?
Go ahead, take a stab.
So,
and I'm happy to add commentary.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is really critical is we may be the intermediary that's delivering the solution to the end user or whoever it is that's being impacted, but we really aren't the customer. I really don't think we are. I mean, technically we may be. Again, I understand what you're saying, Lance, but the real question is, we're finding tools, and the question is, so what's the purpose of the tool that we're bringing in? The tool is intended to do something, hopefully to make something easier for somebody, better for somebody. And the question is, who is that somebody? And from our standpoint, when we're doing our work in conjunction with Greg, because we love to feed, it's great when Greg can feed us all these wonderful insights, and then we can use that to help find the right partners that are working with those tools. Sometimes the target will be providers. Sometimes the target will be staff. Sometimes the provider will be the end user, patient, customer, consumer, whatever you want to refer them to. Sometimes it's a combination thereof, but it really depends on the problem that we're trying to address. And but I think if I think about it, in almost no circumstance would I ever conclude that Cone Health is the customer or the end user who should evaluate it. Sometimes people think that they should, but again, we're trying to enable, and you could argue, well, the providers are part of Cone Health and all those various things, but I don't think of that as the institution is not the target. The target is the people and how we're making their lives better in some way. And if they're part of the institution, that's great. If they aren't part of our institution, that's fine too, because there's a whole bunch of independent folks that work with us. So I don't know. That's my take on it. Greg, anything you would take a different stab at that?
No, I think that's sufficient.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I really appreciate that clarification. Hank, I'd love to hear what makes Wellstar special and what things that you've implemented in your innovation process that you've seen make a difference.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really exciting topic, and I would agree with the sentiments already shared. You know, if you think about the health system and the care provision and care model delivery, innovation's happening all around us, even when we don't recognize it. So the first thing is that there is an inherent problem-solving kind of culture to healthcare in general. Not always formal. Not always disruptive, very incremental a lot of the time. When you look at Wellstar, we've been doing, you know, very innovative things for years. Everything from being, you know, one of the early adopters of AI related to some of the radiology imaging to, you know, to different care innovations on the clinical side, to, you know, bringing in non-clinical type innovations, because of course healthcare has a business side that's running in the background as well. So the first thing is that that's always happening in the background, and some organizations have a little more DNA related to that than others, as we kind of alluded to in some of the questions. How do you take it to the next level? You know, how you take it to the next level is you organize yourself around innovation being a priority from the top. I mean, it is got to be a part of the strategic intent of the organization, both as a vertical and a horizontal in how you execute it. And so that means then thinking about it very differently than just innovation happening accidentally. Turns out there's a lot of intentionality that has to be designed, to Greg's comment, to create some of that magic down the road. So we've been on a journey this year in organizing and launching Catalyst by Wellstar, which is our new global health and innovation center that is multifaceted. It's structured as a new company, all of those kinds of things to allow both activity in that venture space through our first partnership we announced with Engage VC, as well as creating all of the formalizing the internal processes that are going to allow us to drive the voice of the customer, however you define it, internal customers, external customers. You know, we would not limit how we would think about who we would serve beyond the limit that our mission would lay upon the work. And then all of the mechanisms to engage both inside the organization and outside the organization. So we would share the belief that external innovation has to be brought into the system. So you cannot depend on the great idea surfacing just from that kind of grassroots kind of dynamic. Your sample size is too small inside the organization, and you as an organization aren't funded to drive those kinds of great game-changing type innovations. So we're incredibly excited about the launch of Catalyst, about our first investment. And it's fairly unique in that it's a joint venture with non-healthcare companies. So it's UPS, Home Depot, Delta, Georgia Tech, Inspire Brands, on and on, where we're the only healthcare representative going to market looking for capabilities that solve our common cross-industry problems. And that's that's a very exciting way to bring in technology that doesn't yet exist inside healthcare. It's also how you start leapfrogging from the incremental improvements that we're able to do from operations and from many of the different ways in which we are innovating in real time. It also has allowed us to really expand our thinking to how do we connect this to the community. So innovation can't just be about the health system, it's actually about the health industry, it's about the community, and how do we even connect to philanthropy and those who are trying to do big things in the community. And a lot of times healthcare has been insular. They haven't participated in those except for as the healthcare provider. Well, it turns out we're also an industry, we're also an industry expert that can be a part of some of those cross-industry community-based interventions. And then that, complements what we're already doing in the community as it relates to, almost $1 billion of care that we provided last year from the nonprofit status side of the world. So you start bringing together new structure, all the tools to bring in ideas from the external, the surfacing of problems that we need to go solve, and then a capability approach rather than just an application type approach, and bringing in ideas from local to global is really the formula that we have put together and are excited about how we're now accelerating into that space.
I love, there's a lot of nuggets in there. I just want to pull out one because I don't want it to get passed up. And it's a relationship that you have with Engage Ventures, which sounds very similar to me as Pronova has with Cone Health. And so Engage Ventures is a venture fund whose limited partners or LPs are large corporations, generally headquartered, I believe, in Atlanta, like Chick-fil-A and Delta, and now Wellstar, who is using that venture fund to not only invest in potential technologies, but to pull in technologies that can then be piloted by the limited partners. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And the dynamic is that you have this innovation platform, plus you have the venture backing combined. So really exciting from a healthcare standpoint, because all of those companies that you just listed feel like they're healthcare companies now after the last 18 months. And so as we began discussions with Engage, they were looking for a healthcare partner to bring that voice into the room. And at the same time, we see the incredible value of understanding Delta's journey on their digital experience. I mean, Chick-fil-A, having gotten to know their digital team, think about what they did in the context of the global pandemic. It wasn't an accident that at least in North Carolina and Georgia, we heard a lot of, well, what if Chick-fil-A was running the vaccine distribution? Because, on a dime, they were more profitable than they were before the pandemic within about a 2 to 3 week period because of this connection between digital to brick and mortar. And although selling chicken sandwiches doesn't sound like it's like healthcare, but we sell chicken sandwiches too. In a sense, people expect them to be hot when they're delivered, i.e. high quality and safe. And the reality is that you can have the best app and digital experience in the world. If they served a cold chicken sandwich, it wouldn't matter because you'd only remember the cold chicken sandwich. And so in healthcare, as we're continuing that transformation that we have been on this digital to brick and mortar, and it was accelerated in a big way, we can't lose focus of we still have to to deliver a hot chicken sandwich, and that the digital and brick and mortar connect. So that collaboration between the different industries, we really think is a secret sauce, because it's bringing in ideas and learnings that we wouldn't have had just from healthcare alone collaborations. That being said, we're not limited to outside of the industry as we think about this, but we also thought that going in that direction as our first investment and partnership really set a tone in the organization and in the marketplace about where we thought it was headed.
Are you saying then, Hank, that Wellstar is going to have Chick-fil-A now in their cafeteria? Just a second.
There's no announcement on any new partnerships related to food in our cafeterias.
Yeah, you heard it here first.
But it has been an incredible learning to kind of step in and learn from the UPSs, and honestly, they're learning from us too. So we sometimes sell short that healthcare has something to offer in those cross-industry kind of discussions. And I think it's a natural part of kind of the humbleness that a lot of times we bring into our mission. But there's a reality that healthcare and the lens of healthcare into those other industries, it's also game changing for them too. So it really just has it's got so many upsides.
Awesome. Thanks for going into a little bit more detail about Engage and that partnership. So Greg, I want to jump to you. You've mentioned now several times about design thinking, human-centered design, and you've also mentioned the importance of defining these terms so that we're coming from a standard place or a place of context. I'd love to hear more from you on those two particular terms. What do you mean by that in general? And then we can kind of dive deeper into that as we go forward.
Yeah, so I would say just as disruptive innovation has sort of been bastardized in many ways, so has design thinking. And for example, I have a relative who's now president of an insurance company, and he said, "Oh yeah, we did design thinking the other day." I was like, "What do you mean you did it the other day?" He said, "Oh yeah, we all got in a room and we spent 3 hours wasting our time throwing ideas on the wall on Post-it notes." And I said, "Well, how did that go?" He's like, "It was a waste of time. We got nothing out of it." And I said, "You didn't do design thinking, trust me." So I can maybe share my screen and share a model that, I know that it looks like in our crew here, Andrea might be familiar with this. Let's see here. So yeah, here's what's called sort of the double diamond of design thinking. And this is a model we follow. It's nothing special. You can go dig this up if you look up double diamond or design. And I'm not going to go through all this, but at a high level, essentially, you look at these two parts, right? The first part is really about discovery and defining what you've learned, right? It's about making sure you're designing the thing right, whatever that is. You go in not knowing, you go in open-minded, curious. There's primary and secondary research that occurs here based on however you define the work that you're trying to take on. And there's a divergence and convergence process, right? The discovery process is a divergent, wide open, curious, let's go learn. Let's go really understand people. Let's observe them. Let's see what they're doing. Let's spend time with them. Now that things are opening up, we'll probably be getting back into people's homes. We'll go spend 3 hours in somebody's home, exploring and learning about who they are, how they think, what they believe, what they do. And then we curate those insights. We convert observations and what we learn into insights. And then we define what we think those opportunities are. What are the insights that really hold a tension between what they're experiencing today and what could be, right? It's the disparity between those two things that we're looking for, where that tension is. And then we explore, we start ideating. And Hank, I love what you're saying. I mean, you were talking about a fundamental principle of design, which is we don't just look from within our own our own scope of what we understand, we explore, we go out. Biomimicry has become a huge methodology for solving problems. I mean, the idea with biomimicry is that, look, our natural environment has solved every problem we are trying to solve. We just have to go look how nature has solved the problems we're trying to address. So that's become an interesting source of inspiration. But we'll look outside of our own industry. We develop ideas, and then as we start to think about making meaning of those, we got to make sure we got it right. So we will go back to people that we interviewed, and we'll share our ideas. We'll say, here you go. Did we solve your problem? Right? And if they say, yes, you did, or no, you missed it, that's incredibly valuable. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell. It's about discovery. It's about figuring out what we need to design, and then figuring out how to design it in the right way. So I could probably share some examples of what that has looked like for us. One, we're currently building a new health and well-being center. And in that process, one of the things that we learned by spending a lot of time with people was that if we're going to meet the needs of our community, our adults, our parents, we've got to address kids. And so you'll see this facility we're building now we're putting a substantial effort into designing an amazing experience for kids and around child development. Because parents won't make the trade-off. They won't stick their kid in a child care holding pen while they go to the doctor, while they go work out, while they go meet with a dietitian. They won't make that trade-off because it feels crappy when the kid comes back and says, please don't make me go there again. So we're trying to eliminate that trade-off where we've got kids begging to go to this place. Then all of a sudden the parents say, I'm free. Chick-fil-A. I see parents all the time sitting alone talking while their kids are off in the jungle thing playing around. Or in our Chick-fil-A, Connie, she sits there and she does art with kids. Parents are freed up for a minute to have an adult conversation. Same thing, right? So that's one example. Another example is, we just opened a new women's center. And in that design process, we learned that women that just lost their baby oftentimes have to walk down out of the front doors past the lobby of a bunch of expectant moms. And they just learned that they're not going to have a baby. That's not okay. So one of the things that we did in our facility there was we designed a grieving room, which a lot of people have. We also designed a door that was, accessible, where they don't have to walk out of the front door. It's small things like that you start learning and figuring out how do we design and meet the needs of people. So it's a rigorous process. It's not something that we do in a day. It's not something we do in an hour. There is great rigor that we put to the design thinking process. And we have a team to support that. We have applied anthropologists on our team. We have artists. We have strategists. And we're growing that team to support the rigorous process we put in place.
Awesome. Thanks for going through that definition. I would love to ask more about that team and how did you grow and how did you fund that team, which I think is going to be relevant, but we can address that here a little bit later. I'd like to ask the audience actually another polling question. Now that they understand what design thinking is or how you define it, I'd like to know, is this part of your everyday vocabulary, or is this a term you've heard before but weren't quite sure what it was, or is it a term that you've heard for the first time today? So Heather, if we can pull that polling question up, I'd love to hear the responses of our audience.
I've got that pulled up on screen share. Are you seeing it, Lance?
Yep, now I got it. Thanks a lot.
Great. Yep.
So as we're getting a little bit of live feedback here, Greg, what are your thoughts? I mean, the people that you encounter in your organization and outside, is this pretty typical that they all understand what design thinking is, but haven't really used it or just dabbled in it? Or is it something that's you fairly often have to explain to people so that they can kind of get on the same page as you?
I think there is some, I think this is pretty representative, actually. I think that the rigor behind it is a little bit more rare. There's a lot of shortcuts that are often taken in the process. And, I think what we see showing up here is very representative of conversations that I have.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thanks for your questions, everybody submitting them in the chat box. I believe we're answering a lot of them just in the conversation that we're having. There's a few that we're holding off to the side that we'll get to a little bit later, but please continue to submit them as they come up. I'd love to take some time between some of these breaks to answer. I'd like to move on now and talk a little bit more about, we've already addressed the issue of partnerships. I'd like to start actually with another polling question before we dive into this with our panelists. But each of our panelists have mentioned partnerships as a key component of their strategy. And we want to know if your organization has tried partnerships to drive innovation efforts. So I'm going to pull up another polling question here. Simple yes or no. Glad to see there's quite a significant majority of yes, some sort ofs. Give it a few more seconds. All right, so I'd say definitely majority yes, some sort ofs obviously in there, about a third, and then very, very few no's. But that's really encouraging. What I'd like to ask next to the audience, another polling question, is for those of you who did answer yes, or even sort of, was it successful? Yes, no, sort of? Where do you stand on that part? I think many of us look at partnerships as a risk. You really don't know, who necessarily you're committing yourself to at the beginning, and you kind of find out as you go along. And sometimes it's more than you ever could expect. Sometimes it's a lot less. And in our risk-averse environment of healthcare, it's oftentimes it's taken very cautiously. That's really encouraging. 6.8 successful, 6.3. Maybe I should stop talking because it'll probably start to drop if I keep going. But overall, it looks like it's a successful partnership. The ones that have had a partnership have had some success. Very few. And we're going to define what success means to these partners and these panelists here on stage or on this call with us. But success obviously is another subjective definition that we should nail down. What exactly do we mean by that? What are the metrics of success for partnerships? So that brings me to my next question for the panelists, and I'd love all of you to take a stab at this. Jay, I'll hand it over to you first. But we talk about partnerships and how they bring value, from cost sharing to leveraging expertise, accelerating implementation of a new process. But I'm sure you've been in a partnership where you've been thrown a curveball. And I think those are the kind of examples that we learn the most from, not necessarily flat out failures, but things that you had to modify your strategy around or accommodate. So I'd love to hear about a specific example where you were thrown a curveball. What did you do to work through it? And then something that you've learned and gained from that experience. So could you start us off, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a project that we started with Greg's team several years ago, and it grew out from some great design thinking work, and they identified exactly what they were looking for, the conditions of satisfaction. And we went out and did a massive search, started with over 300 potential partners and whittled it down. And we found a very small group that we met with, and then in the end selected a partner. So we went through a rather extensive process of this selection, and we included all the different areas of the organization in the process. And we had some areas in the organization that were resistant, mostly about the whole idea of bringing in the partner. I mean, I'd say it was a fundamental objection rather than an objection specifically to this person, this company, although there are some of those as well. And through that process, the overwhelming consensus was, yes, this is the right party. Yes, we should move forward. And we did move forward, and decision was made to move forward. And I think the thought was, well, won't worry about these few outliers. They'll come along as we move down the path. That didn't happen. It actually, I think it was one of the biggest mistakes that we've done. When you identify resistance like that, you have to deal with it head on. You can't just say, oh, well, they'll eventually come to the light and they'll see it. No, they won't. They actually will build up evidence why it was that this was the wrong decision all along, and they get more and more and more ingrained. And what ultimately happened was, in the end, it led to the deal blowing up, because the resistance built and built and built just from these few small outliers that everybody had agreed, oh, it's not a big deal. It'll work out. And in the end, it completely upended the deal, and was a huge loss, I believe, to the organization, not just in money, but time and in the outcomes we were trying to drive. So I think the lesson that I derive from that is, I mean, I'm assuming most organizations like to build consensus cones, certainly does, but you have to deal with those outliers. You really have to get somebody to disagree, but commit to working with you. And I think we neglected in that. I think it was more it's not many of them, let's just move forward without really enrolling them. And that was a very painful mistake that we made that was quite costly.
Thanks for talking about that. Innovation is certainly a team sport, and it's not always that you're going to get everybody on the same side, but having a strategy to manage those that have dissenting opinions is a hard lesson to learn sometimes. Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a similar circumstance where you had to shift or change strategies in order to accommodate a curveball.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to share, the same example that was quite, I poured over 2 years of design work into what we were trying to do there, and in the end, to see it go down in flames was quite hard. So huge lessons learned from that, as Jay certainly described. I will say, all isn't lost, right? So we did learn a lot from what we were trying to design. It has forced conversation and a process for how we need to work better together across functions. That has risen up to the top and is being driven now from the very top, which I think, Hank, you even said, innovation has to happen from the top. You've got to be completely on board. So we've recognized that our process completely broke down. And we've got to get clear. Decision rights are huge, and defining those decision rights, making sure that we're aligned strategically on what we're trying to do from an innovation perspective. I also think setting very clear expectations around what these partnerships will look like. As digital technology and health systems from a security standpoint are ramping up, the scrutiny that we give to these partners that may or may not come from healthcare is increasing. And so the companies that we're working with, expecting them to check every box from a security standpoint is unrealistic.
On day one.
And so from day one, you cannot expect it. If you're going to bring in innovation from the outside, from outside the industry, or even from within the industry, we've got to make a choice to say, we believe we have the right partner, let's get behind them. let's help them get to where they need to be. Cone Health is now a high trust organization from a technology standpoint, security standpoint. Not everybody we work with is going to meet that criteria. So I think we've got to make a choice to say, once we find a company and partner, we're going to help them get there, versus say, they don't check the box, they're gone, right? So those are some of the challenges that we're navigating.
Lance, if I can add one other thing. Can I add another thought? On this, on the decision rights thing, I mean, one of the things that I hadn't realized, again, I don't have that long of a history in healthcare, is there's a lot of legacy decision rights and legacy processes that exist in lots of different places within a health system. And I continue to be amazed when we trip over one, that because we came along and we were new to the game and we had a process put in place and we didn't know that this was going to really infringe on somebody else's process or rights or something. We didn't know. We didn't know what we didn't know. And so I think there needs to be, when you got to create the process as Greg is talking about, but we have to find a way to get it communicated so that people can understand. We're not trying to mess your process up. We're trying to move the health system forward in an innovative fashion. And so we all need to get on board to saying, let's figure out how to resolve this for both parties, because I think there's a lot of unintended pain that has been created just because we weren't aware of these different things that existed down in the bowels of the organization. So I think it's something to be aware of as you're trying to move something new forward. You will trip over something you didn't know was there. And you got to make sure people understand that's not the goal, and hopefully they'll work with you to try to overcome it.
And just last comment is, we talk a lot about how we transgress the organization. We will share a design and we will have functions all over say, wait, that's my area. Well, of course it is. Design transgresses across the organization, and it feels transgressive to many of the leaders. And so I think being clear around setting expectations that the design work that we're doing will flow into your area, and we have to align around what role you play, how that works from the top down.
Awesome. I have like 3 follow-up questions, but I want to get to some of these other ones that we have planned before. So I'm actually going to go to you next, Hank. And your experiences on one of these partnerships causing a curveball, and what did you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, so there are lots of examples, both inside the partnerships and inside great ideas that are internal, right? And many of them kind of are similarly themed to alignment, communication, all that kind of thing. The one thing I'll kind of point out is connecting the project itself to the outcome that you're trying to derive, and getting your executive leadership all aligned to that it's the same outcome and the same motivator, I think is really important. Because with innovation, you may have, motivation to practically make an impact. You may have motivation to be innovating for the sake of innovating. You could have, a motivation that this is a door opener to the next big opportunity. There's so many different things that executives are balancing against as these big ideas and partnerships are kind of being developed, that making sure that you're all aligned to the actual outcome that you're trying to arrive at, and that it's realistic to the stage at which the innovation and the partnership is going to be at in the beginning and through its kind of initial progression. The example around security and outside is a great one. It's all those kinds of things that create these, places that you trip because of the story someone's made up in their head. So this can be with the people who are the evangelists. So I'm taking the opposite angle, not the resistance, but the evangelists who have a different outcome from what they think this partnership is going to bring, and have certainly a few scars and maybe a stitch or two from not having that kind of discussion on the front end of the partnership, because then it's left to your imagination. It's funny how your brain makes up a story, and a story made up in an executive's brain on a partnership you're running isn't always fun, are not as fun as the partnership itself usually. So anyway, that's what I would add to that. I think it's the opposite lens, not the resistors, it's the evangelists, making sure you're evangelizing about the same outcome.
Fabulous. Great comment.
Great point.
Can I add a point on that, which is a lot of times we evaluate in design, we evaluate based on, you'll see this Venn diagram, right? Desirability, feasibility, and viability. There's a missing circle, which is culturability, right? Can you integrate these things into the culture and how the culture operates and thinks about ideas? I think that's a missing circle in that Venn diagram. I know that we've started to pay more attention to.
Probably one of the most difficult things to manage as well is the culture piece. I'd like to skip to probably our last question of the event, but we're going to start with a polling question. In one word, what do you think is a viable, effective metric for innovation? And Heather's going to put up a word cloud, so it's going to be a little bit of a different response here, but you'll see a number of words that just pop up from people's responses. Those that are responded to multiple times, the word usually grows or gets darker or bolded. Let's see if this works. Maybe I'm hyping up all this excitement and it doesn't do anything. Let's see. There we go. Once again, what is a viable, effective metric for innovation? I think this is the crux of the discussion, is how do you measure yourself? How do you know that you're successful? We can talk all day long about innovation and the processes and how cutting edge we are. But until we can point to an objective metric that demonstrates what we are about and how we accomplish that, then it's really just show. So change implementation. I'm just going to call out a couple of these. Reputation, revenue. I think revenue is something that comes up almost in every conversation that we have about metrics, especially around innovation. ROI, stickiness, discomfort. That's an interesting metric. How uncomfortable are you? Patient satisfaction, patient staff satisfaction, can't exclude that. Turnovers, how many ideas are adopted? I really like that one. One that I've used in the past is how many pilots have we secured in the course of a year? So let's hear from our panelists. All of you, I'm sure, have metrics around your innovation process. So tell us what those metrics are that drive and that were part of the designing of your innovation programs, and which metrics have proven to be effective, which ones haven't, and how would you do it over if you had to, as far as how you're measuring your success. And I know a lot of this can be a little premature, but let's hear kind of short-term versus long-term metrics. When we talk about revenue and innovation, that can be 5, 10, 15 years down the road, if that. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on all of those points. And I'll just turn it over to the panelists. Whoever would like to go first, please take it away.
I'll jump in, Lance. I mean, so I think there's different levels of metrics, and there's some that are easy, and I'm not saying they're the best, but we often grab a hold of the easy ones. I mean, we do a fair number of activity metrics, and while none of us want to just be judged on the activity, we want outcomes because of the length of time it takes. Oftentimes we do track. How many deals have we looked at? How many have we diligenced? How many deals have we signed? How many pilots have we completed? You mentioned that. I'm a real believer in a lot of experimentation and a lot of piloting, and I do believe that our success is a function of that. So we do look at activity metrics, even though we would like to say that we don't, because it's such a long process. So I'll pause there. There's other buckets that we do, but that's probably the biggest bucket that we're taking a look at, other than long-term financial success generated from our deals.
So I'll jump in and kind of go a little higher level to say learning is one of the ultimate currencies of all of this work. And that is a hard one to intersect with the hard dashboard culture of health systems in general. Because typically we measure in terms of, margin and, patient satisfaction and NPS and all of the different kinds of kind of hard metrics, which are all important. But particularly as you're getting started in this space, you're going to be stubbing your toe a lot. And the collection of those learnings and the harvesting of those learnings, and then how you leverage them is a huge value metric. The other thing is you can metric yourself to death. So if you measure it like you do the rest of the company, then you will not succeed, and it will, it'll be a 2-3 year innovation project, and then it'll be on to the next thing, because the usual metrics aren't going to work. And then I love the long view dynamic, which is to say, yes, there are these things that you're going to track your operations of it. How many people you're talking to, all the different kinds of things that Jay mentioned. But on the long view, what are you really trying to accomplish? And making sure that whatever you're really trying to accomplish, you are setting up checkpoints for that through your metrics as well. So learning at the top line, short-term operational metrics, but a long view aimed at wherever you're really headed.
Greg, anything to add?
I think some of the things that we're designing are really hard to measure and to track. The example I gave of the woman that loses the baby and is comforted and doesn't have to walk out the front door. How do you measure that? Is that about long-term retention, sort of loyalty? What is that, right? And are you going to get people to, operational leaders to actually go measure that somehow? That's a long-term metric, very hard. So how do you measure experience? A lot of what we do is experience design. I can tell you from a gut level, there's a huge impact in terms of loyalty, in terms of increasing brand equity, right? Decreasing leakage out of your system. But I think just saying, hey, we're going to increase brand equity, that doesn't translate in healthcare, where we are so driven by hard numbers. So that's honestly, I think I'd love to ask this group. There's a lot of brilliant people in this call. I'd love to know if you guys have anything to put in the chat. How do you measure experience? Because this is high on my radar and something I'm trying to figure out and I'm working towards right now. So I'd love to ask you all, how do you measure experience?
Thanks for that. Yeah, please contribute in the chat if you'd like to answer Greg's question. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I'd like to just wrap it up with each of you, maybe one piece of advice, a couple of sentences of, people that are considering starting their own innovation programs or having to go to stakeholders and win them over to consider their ideas. What would you recommend? Just a one-liner would be helpful. Whoever would like to go first.
I'll take a stab. So people got into this business for a reason, oftentimes because they want to impact people's lives in a positive way. I'm very biased as a designer. There's a lot of resources out there around design thinking. Tap into that. It's a lever that you can pull to increase your impact, your ability to draw people, leaders into your vision around innovation. Tap into their sense of wanting to make a difference in the world and how you do that through a design perspective, the humanity of that.
I think my one-liner would be avoid innovation theater. I think one of the real challenges that we all face is top management's very interested in innovation. They want to be innovative, but you really got to look at your program in terms of saying, what are you really going to do here? And, just putting money into high-tech startups doesn't change your innovation inside your health system. Doing a lot of things that people do to say, look, I'm innovative, it's sort of the old thing back in the old days when you put a suggestion box out and say, well, we got suggestions, so now we're responsive. There's a whole bunch of things that people do, and actually some people may say they're doing design thinking when they're really not, and that they check that box and say, look, now we can feel innovative. Innovation's important, but it's hard work. And so really try to avoid that quick and easy fix. If you found something that you said, this is the magic bullet, it's probably not. And you need to work a little harder to try to uncover what you really can do to have an impact in your health system.
What I'll add is it's about the mission and it's about the people. And if you frame it around the mission and the people, then you're never going to go wrong.
Thank you all so much. What a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate you taking the time to give us your insights and your experiences. I'm going to turn it over.